Hello.
Hello.
That's right. It is YouTube time this time all the time.
If you like poetry, if you like literature, if you like cultural history, then you've come to the right place. We make podcasts about all of those things. So be sure to like and share this video. And of course, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload.
Since we mostly make podcasts, you can also find our shows on all the major podcast platforms. So if you found this video, but YouTube isn't your speed for regular podcast listening, head over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe there.
All right. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast. I am your co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And I am your other co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And we have got an all-new poem for you today, a wonderful one as always. We've had a couple rebroadcasts as of late, but we are back with new, fresh goodness. And we are recording from the same place we always record, which is in our respective homes. But I have been in my home for, well, quite a while, but 2 days going without leaving outside, which is not recommended because you need to get a little walk in there, working on that. But yeah, it's a wild and terrifying time. And I hope everyone is safe out there and finding ways to be healthy, both physically and mentally. And I hope that, I always like podcasts to have a little friend with me wherever I go. And I hope this podcast can be a little of something of that for you today.
Absolutely. I have also been indoors for the last 2 days because Connor is in Minnesota. I have decamped from my usual locale in New York City up here to Bennington, Vermont, where I am hiding out. And it snowed, a whole bunch of snow. So I technically could have gone out to walk around, but did not really want to do that. So yeah, been inside. As Connor said, doing the best to stay physically and mentally active and engaged, finding creative home workouts for my brain and my body. If you have access to an outdoor space, I'm experimenting. I got a bunch of rocks together from around the yard. I think I'm going to run around with them or something because, why not? You got to find the weights where you can when you can't go to the
Sure.
gym. So, working on that.
Yeah.
And if that's going to do it for my body, yeah, got to find the podcasts for the mind. I've been listening to some Intelligence Squared debates. And, for those of you listening to this episode, maybe this is the first episode of Close Talking you've come across. We've got 80 other ones that, they're there if you need them.
This actually might be number 90.
That's true. We've got 89 other ones. They're out there. They're chilling in cyberspace waiting for you to, download them or not. Do what you feel.
Well, this poem, I think, will be, I hope, especially meaningful during this time. I've loved it for a long time. It's by the poet Adrienne Rich, who's one of our great poets, one of the great American poets. She was born in 1948, I believe, and she won the Yale Younger Poets Prize. She won the National Book Award for her book Diving into the Wreck. That's probably one of her most famous poems, is the title poem Diving into the Wreck. Yeah, just like a wonderful radical poet who really kind of, I feel like, walked the walk of what, a transformative poetics could be. And I feel like this poem is a really good example of that. And yeah, it's a little on the longer side, so I think we should just get right into it. This poem is part of a larger sequence that's called an Atlas of the Difficult World. This section is called Dedications. I know you are reading this poem late. Before leaving your office, of the one intense yellow lamp spot in a darkening window, in the lassitude of a building faded to quiet long after rush hour. I know you are reading this poem standing up in a bookstore far from the ocean on a gray day of early spring, faint flakes driven across the plain's enormous spaces around you. I know you are reading this poem in a room where too much has happened for you to bear, where the bedclothes lie in stagnant coils on the bed, and the open valise speaks of flight, but you cannot leave yet. I know you are reading this poem as the underground train loses momentum, and before running up the stairs toward a new kind of love your life has never allowed. I know you are reading this poem by the light of the television screen, where soundless images jerk and slide while you wait for the newscast from the Intifada. I know you are reading this poem in a waiting room, of eyes met and unmeeting, of identity with strangers. I know you are reading this poem by fluorescent light, in the boredom and fatigue of the young who are counted out, count themselves out at too early an age. I know you are reading this poem through your failing sight, the thick lens enlarging these letters beyond all meaning, yet you read on, because even the alphabet is precious. I know you are reading this poem as you pace beside the stove warming milk, a crying child on your shoulder, a book in your hand, because life is short and you too are thirsty. I know you are reading this poem which is not your language, guessing at some words while others keep you reading, and I want to know which words they are. I know you are reading this poem listening for something, torn between bitterness and hope, turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. I know you are reading this poem because there is nothing else left to read, there where you have landed, stripped as you are. Whew. Man, this poem gets me every time.
Yeah. Yeah. It builds so quietly.
Yeah, it really does.
Which I don't know. Oftentimes I feel like kind of no matter how many times I've read the poem for myself or read it aloud, like when I hear you reading it, it's a totally different experience. And that is something that I think I'd kind of noticed, but noticed so much more hearing somebody else reading it aloud, just the way that it accumulates.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, and because it's always like, no matter how many times like you read it, you're in different places each time you're reading it or whatever, but it's still you. And when there's like another person, I don't know, just like I feel the same way too when you read poems and like the different parts that other people like lean into or emphasize or de-emphasize, and it's like a cover of a song or something. There's like a different texture that brings out something more. But yeah, it does build in such a beautiful way. And yeah, I guess maybe before we get too into it, we could do a little narrative summary. I mean, basically, it's kind of an address to this number of different people. And it's like, I know you are reading this poem, and then it's sort of describing a different person and their situation. And so the first person we have is like leaving their office kind of at the end, having a long day at work. The next person is in a bookstore, and they're maybe in the Midwest, and there's the plains, and it's sort of snowing in early spring. aka they're me in Minnesota right now. And the next person, I know you're reading this poem in a room where too much has happened for you to bear. It's unclear what exactly the situation, but it's like possibly a situation of like domestic violence or some kind of like, they know that they have to leave, but they cannot leave yet. There's something unsafe in that space. Then there's someone who like has found a new love and is on the train and is like reading the poem as the train is sort of getting to their stop. There's someone who's watching the news or has the news on of the Intifada. This poem was written, I think, finished in like 1990 or 1991.
I believe
so
91 after the Gulf War, which it was
that
partially
would make
in
sense.
response to.
I think that's probably right. And then there's someone in a waiting room, in like a doctor's office or a hospital. There's someone who's young by fluorescent light. There's someone who's older, who's like, eyes are failing. There's someone who's a parent, perhaps a mother, who has a child on their shoulder. There's someone whose first language is not English and they're reading it. And then the kind of last ones are sort of move into the more abstract, basically. And that's kind of like, what the poem is.
And how is this contextualized within the rest of the longer piece, since it is an excerpt?
I would say it covers a lot of ground, but the title actually does like a lot of explanatory work, an atlas of the difficult world. And like, it's like trying to map out where to position oneself within like the whatever that is called America kind of thing. And like trying to reckon with and like hold accountable both being of it, but also like all the people that have been forgotten and like oppressed in various ways by the thing, whatever that is America kind of thing.
That's always like a fascinating project, poetically or otherwise. I know I personally choose to read a lot of stuff that deals with those themes and artistically attacks them. But I think it's particularly interesting to be doing that between 88 and 91, because that was the period of sort of geopolitical power transition where the Soviet Union falls, the United States becomes the only remaining superpower, and then you have this immediate test of what George H.W. Bush and others immediately termed the New World Order, which was the Gulf War, where he successfully brought together a coalition of countries to take unified military action through international institutions, like proving that cooperation of a certain kind in a certain context was possible. But what you then have is, as you were saying, for Adrienne Rich, her poetic project is both situating not just what does it mean to be American, but particularly focusing on people who've been left out of that national narrative or who have been marginalized in different ways. But there's also this question at that same time that is kind of confronting even heteronormative America or the collective idea of the United States as a country, where the question is, where does the United States fit in the world now that the balance of power that had been dominant throughout the entire second half of the 20th century, since you can either time it to the end of the Second World War in 45 or to 49 when the Soviet Union first developed and tested nuclear weapons, but you had what in the international relations world is termed the bipolar world, where you have two superpowers, to now having one. There's this sort of two levels of uncertainty going on there, where there's this overlay of geopolitical uncertainty, and then there's the constant uncertainty of marginalized populations within the country, which I find an interesting, I don't know, that was in the back of my head as I was reading through this, because I think this excerpt, I should say, from the poem is specifically dealing with that highly personal piece and that sort of individual piece. But I was thinking about all of these yous existing in a country where that's kind of the bigger question in the background at all times.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's exactly right. It reminds me, there's another poem of hers. It's got like the funniest title ever. It's like trying to have a conversation with a man or something like that. And
haven't
it's
we all
pretty
at one
funny,
point
but
or another either tried or, if we're honest, been that man?
Yeah. But yeah, the man in the poem on bad behavior, but there's like this kind of thing where on the one hand it's about this relationship, but then on the other hand they're in like the Southwest desert where the US has been like testing nuclear bombs. And so there's this kind of like, metaphor between that and then this relationship between the speaker and the man, which kind of is like that one is sort of more explicitly talking about the larger geopolitical situation. But it's very true that Rich has always was very politically committed in an intense way. When she won the National Book Award in 1974, the two other writers who had been nominated were Alice Walker and Audre Lorde. And they had agreed beforehand that whichever one won, they would sort of accept it all together in solidarity. And she basically read this statement that they had all written together. And, it sort of said like one part, we, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, and Alice Walker, together accept this word in the name of all the women whose voices have gone and still go unheard in a patriarchal world. And things like that, which is pretty badass.
Hell yeah.
And then like 20 years later, in 97, the Clinton administration awarded her the National Medal of the Arts, and she declined to accept it because she wrote, the very meaning of art, as I understand it, is incompatible with the cynical politics of this administration.
Adrienne Rich,
anyway.
dunking on neoliberals forever.
Yep. Anyway, so pretty cool. There's a great collected poems of all Rich's poems, which are a lot. It's a hefty tome. But there's a great introduction by Claudia Rankine, which I recommend. And there's a part, kind of what you were talking about, where Rankine's actually talking about the collection, the Atlas of a Difficult World, where this poem comes from. So Rankine's talking about coming across this book. I approached the volume thinking I knew what it would hold, but found myself transported by Rich's profound exploration of ethical loneliness. Rich called forward voices created in a precarious world. Although the term, quote, ethical loneliness would come to me years later from the work of the critic Jill Stauffer, I understood Rich to be drawing into her stanzas the voices of those who have been, in the words of Stauffer, she has this book called Ethical Loneliness, and she defines that as people who, quote, have been abandoned by humanity, compounded by the experience of not being heard. The way I understand it is like, rather than a kind of like personal loneliness in which you find yourself, lonely, like just by happenstance or your own psychology or whatever. Ethical loneliness is like the kind of socio-political conditions have made it so that you experience this kind of profound loneliness, which is to say, a system that, does not listen to women of color, Black women, queer women, all these kinds of groups of people who are excluded both in discursive and like material terms, or like such that I think the idea of it is that their personal, experience is fundamentally lonely because of this larger like systemic thing. Claudia Rankine, her book, I highly recommend, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, is like all about that subject. But I think this like last poem, getting back to the excerpt, these people that she's kind of reaching out to. I know you're reading this poem. There's the young person who has been counted out or count themselves out. There's the person whose, room holds too much for them to bear. There's someone who is in an area where they, the dominant language is not their first language. There's all these kinds of people who through the details of the poem she's kind of like laying out this, map or constellation of people who have been forgotten in some way by the larger world. And, I think in like the simplest sense, the poem is a kind of like reaching out to them and being like, like one of my favorite parts of the poem is like at the end, I know you're reading this poem, which is not your language, guessing at some words while others keep you reading, and I want to know which words they are. Like, I feel like when we think of, the poet is the declarer of wisdom, and then you read it and you're like, wow, oh my God, what a, thank you for imparting that upon me kind of thing. But this, like, the gesture of I want to know what words they are is a kind of reversal of the like traditional role of the speaker rather than someone who's saying something. It's asking for something from the reader in a way.
Which is also the first time in the poem that we get the I that's not saying I know. And it's such a profoundly...
Yeah.
It's interesting because I don't think you get the sense of any sort of overly authoritarian I, even though you do get this voice saying, I know something about people all over the country, which could come off as a little bit, I don't know, surveillance statey or something. But it doesn't. And I think the reason it doesn't is because there's a very empathetic quality to what the eye has noticed. It's not just that it's, I don't know, clinically observing. It feels very intimately involved, and it feels like a very nurturing knowing of what the person is doing with this poem. Like, I know you're reading this poem, and I'm understanding the circumstances through which you are coming to the work that I have put together. So even though it is this declarative I, it also feels like a very, I don't know, empathetic I. And I feel like that is such a moment where you then see that the way that you're probably reading the poem is reaffirmed for you there, because the I says, I see you. And what I love about the phrasing of you are reading this poem, which is not your language, is that it works both on the level of literally maybe English is not your first language, but also maybe poetry is not your thing. And you happen to be reading this poem, and it's written in a way that's not meant for you usually, but there's parts of it that you kind of get along with. You're guessing at some words while others keep you reading, and I want to know which words they are. And I love that the they isn't specified. Does the poet want to know the words that you're guessing at, or the words that keep you reading? Or both? I love that ambiguity, and I do, as you were pointing out, I love that the I is reaching out saying, I want something from you too. Because I feel like really productive, thoughtful, artistic relationships don't have to take the audience into account, but the ones that I resonate most with, the artists I resonate most with, are the ones who take very seriously the fact that they are writing for an audience. And it doesn't mean that they pander to the audience, but they take the audience's needs into consideration when they're putting their own work together. What does my audience need to hear from me? What do I need to communicate to them? It's not just about putting out work, or like, it's not necessarily adversarial. It can be challenging, but it still has that level of empathy to it. And I feel like that's a lot of what I really was feeling coming off of this poem, was that kind of artistic relationship to the audience, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, it's such a relational poem in that it's something I think about a lot. And I think this is partly why I was drawn to this poem, like at this particular time, is we're all hopefully sheltering in place. And it's a kind of very starkly isolating experience, and has created all these sorts of challenges of like, I'm still a social person. Like, how do I, meet my social needs, or, in the most basic sense. I don't know. It's just interesting that, there's like the Zoom kind of meetings, the Skype hangouts, the Google hangouts, and they're all both wonderful and also, of course, not the same as in person, but they were interesting to me in that they're this like very explicit kind of like connection, like reaching out. It's like, now I am, like when you don't have to hunker down in a room you can just like move throughout the world, and then it's like, oh, and then I was at this place because of that reason, and then I talked to this person, and then like I ran into like, what's their name, and then we talked for a long time, and then like, well, like this person was dropping something off like at my home, and we were talking da da da. Because of how crazy life can be, and also just like normal life being so fluid, it can be easy to take for granted the kind of like the actual nature of like what a relational connection is with someone, like a social thing, which is just like I am in a body and you are in a body, and like we are being attentive to each other for a period of time, and like communicating and like emoting, and from our respective, skin uh, like masks and like weird brain organ things that we are stuck behind, like make this experience for both of ourselves where we don't feel like we're just alone, but like that we're with someone. That was a very weird way of saying that.
Yeah, I
But
feel like you
what
rode the line between like academic and serial killer really effectively. Our weird brain meat hidden behind our skull skin.
Oh, God. I'm very sorry. My apologies to everybody.
No, I love
All
it.
I
I mean,
meant to.
it's one of the wonderful things that makes you who you are, but I felt like
Oh,
we were
God.
sort of teetering on the edge of like.
Yeah, we it almost got out of hand there. Slash, it probably did, but I brought it back. Um, but I don't know, what this experience to me like has kind of like raised the curtain on like what that interaction actually is, I guess, if that makes sense, where it's like, oh, I'm not like constantly running into people. People are important. I need to like schedule a time to like be connected with someone, and then it's going to be in this, it's virtual, and so it's like then there's this screen that is the kind of like the medium through which we're connecting. It's kind of like heightened a situation that I think is kind of always existing for everyone to certain degrees, which is just that like fundamentally we are by ourselves, but we also have this, innate need to be connected to others. And like that's like one of the big both joys and like struggles of life, is like how do we sustain this connection when we're like fundamentally different people, kind of thing. And this poem for me was like such a beautiful example of like sort of like expressing that, I guess, and also just kind of what I think poetry does so well, or what it can do, is like it can create that kind of connection across so much space and time. Like when I read a poem from Adrienne Rich, written in like when I was born, and like I feel connected to her, or the speaker or something, in a not the same way that I would feel connected to a friend, but it has the same kind of effect on me, I think. But then the poem itself is sort of demonstrating like what poetry can do, I guess, where it's like you are reading this poem and you are reading this poem and you are reading this poem. And like through the details of the poem, and also like, we get the sense of like these are all discrete people. And because of sort of like who is chosen, we really get like a very like inclusive sense of who is in the world. You know what I mean? It's very interesting. This is a slight aside, but it was reminding me of the poem "If They Come for Us" by Fatima Asghar, which we had talked about a while ago. And similar to that one, there's this repeating refrain, "If they should come for us," and this one is like, "I know you are reading this poem." And then also there's this kind of like expansive listing of people who are very different from each other, but joined by something. But the big difference between that one and this one is like the "If They Should Come for Us" poem, there's this basically this huge we, I feel, where it's like this huge us. Like we are all different, but we're all part of this we. And that kind of like unity is really powerful.
That poem almost feels like a community making project. Like the
Yeah.
listing is meant to be expansive and additive in a way that this poem is not in the same way.
Yeah. It's a recognition of like difference. There's obviously difference in the If They Should Come For Us poem, but there's like a real fundamental difference between the I and the you in this poem. And in a way, that's kind of also the basis for the kind of connection, I guess, which is like, yeah, I don't know. That's what I love so much about this poem.
No, and I totally agree, because it is that this poem preserves a different kind of tension within it, because there is never a collectivization. It's still a bunch of independent yous. I almost imagine like the way that somebody would use this in a prestige drama, where it's like the last episode of the season and the camera, like one of the actors in the series with a cool voice is reading the poem as like voiceover. And the camera just happens to drop in on each of the main characters in their own home doing their own things that may or may not relate to what's going on in the poem, but like that's sort of what this is doing. It's taking the camera across the country and you drop in for a moment on these people in all of their different places, and they happen to be having the same experience of reading this poem, but they are still so fully embedded in their own lives that they do not become the collective we of poem readers at any point. They remain individuals who have this experience in common. And maybe they will cross paths at some point through happenstance, but fundamentally, it's just that there is this within the poem, and kind of, I think, the larger point that Rich is making is that kind of no matter what, we're embedded in our own realities, but there are these points of connection. And like, as you were saying, this poem that was written the year that like we were born can be very impactful. Like the other day, partially I think because of the current degree of social distancing that everybody's doing and whatever, I was listening to Mavis Staples' album from 2008, Hope at the Hideout, and she plays the song We Shall Not Be Moved, like classic. We've all heard it a bunch of times probably. And there's a little speech she talks about in the middle where she's talking about during the civil rights movement, she and other people who were protesting, they'd go sing at the protests, and they'd go in the South. They would basically, when they were like ready for lunch, they would go and stage a sit-in at some local place. And when they were going to get thrown out, they would all sing the song. And like, I've listened to that album many times before. That story is obviously an impactful story, but it was like this huge emotional reaction I had to it that was just like surprising, of the intense like dedication and camaraderie that embodied. That was like a really important, and also like talking about everybody joining hands, the tactile thing, like I could see the images of it because photographers had captured them. And so it is this like, this recording from 2008 about a woman relaying her experiences from the 1950s and 60s can still reach me. And like, there's probably 10 or 12 other people in the country who listened to that recording within the last week, at least. I don't know who they are. I haven't talked to any of them. I literally in my life don't know anybody else who owns this album, but they're out there. Tens of thousands of people bought it, and I'm sure that they've had similar experiences with it. And on some level, I'm aware of that, and it's comforting and cool. And I don't have to meet those people to know that it happened. And I feel like that's some of what's also embedded in this poem, is that idea that all of these people can know that the others are out there, even if they are not connected to them. And that there's some sort of like comfort and connection on that level too.
I think that's really right. And I think that there's so many things happening in this poem that I would love to talk about it for about 40 hours. But the one kind of big poetic move is the repetition of the I know you're reading this poem, and it happens every time. And, it's the fancy word anaphora, but, I've had my piece with anaphora, and I think maybe we can just say repetition. But at any rate, part of the effect of it is simply like it's a nice propulsive, rhythmic, sonic continuity At the same time, the sort of the choice of the phrase, I know you're reading this poem, is like basically, I think, like reinforces all the things that we've kind of talked about. It's one thing to be like, you know, we're all different people and we feel lonely, but we want to be connected and like we can do it. And obviously that sounds terrible and like hokey pokey. But like it's one thing to like describe that. And then it's another thing to kind of like create the effect where you sort of like perceive on a visceral level like, oh, there is this distance between us, and there's also this like space and moment of like connection. And I feel like that's where the magic of the poem is, and that the repetition is like the thing that really does that, because what it is doing is, one, it's like centering the poem. Like it's like, you know, not every poem says it's a poem. And so it's like, okay, here's the moment. Like, I know you're reading this poem. Like, here we are in this space. And then it's also just like, I know you. And, you know, that simple thing of like, if the poem were just like, and you're doing this, and you're doing this, and you're doing that, and you're doing that, like we would have a sense of, you know, the range of experiences, and we would get something out of it. But the kind of like, I know you, that link between the I and the you, and like all this, it's almost like this, like the fact that this is the moment that is the formal propulsive engine and formal kind of grounding tool, because it's the phrase that's repeated and repeated, and because the content is such that it's creating this link the most directly between this I and these yous. Like those work together, I think, to like by the end of the poem really like create this, for me anyway, like palpable effect of like feeling, you know, like I'm one of those yous in a way, even though I haven't been, you know, none of those descriptions describe anything like about me necessarily. And yeah, I just, whew, it's amazing.
It is. Well, it's such, as you were saying, it's such an effective show don't tell of such a nebulous concept that would seem very hard to show in any way, because it's an idea that is in no way concrete about this very specific type of sort of connection, that it's like astonishing to find any mechanism that is able to show that rather than just trying to describe it literally. And it is really effectively done in this poem, as you were saying, especially through the anaphora, or I guess repetition.
Yeah. We can keep an afro. We can keep it. It's good.
Yeah.
It's done
I hear
no
it's
harm.
a useful coping mechanism. Boom. References.
Nice. Ocean Bog. Check it out. It's a great poem.
It's a great poem. And a great book of poems. Way to go, Ocean Vong. So talented.
Okay, I have one question.
Bring it.
Which is, you know, we've talked a lot about the kind of most of the poem, but then this end is kind of, you know, is where it gets like a little more abstract. And, you know, it goes, so I know you're reading this poem listening for something, torn between bitterness and hope, turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. I know you are reading this poem because there is nothing else left to read, there where you have landed, stripped as you are. I mean, damn, it sounds amazing, and I get a lot of chills when I read it, but I'm still kind of working out like, so the bitterness and hope, I get some of it, I think. You know, listening for something, torn between bitterness and hope, turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. So it's obviously, you know, it's abstract, so there's like multiple kinds of meanings that could be, but it's like listening for something is like, okay, why do you go to a poem? You have a yearning for something, you want to hear something, like there's something missing that maybe the poem can fill or something. But then at the same time, a lot of these moments in the poem is like the thing that's also being done while the person is doing the other thing. So, like the parent who's pacing beside the stove, warming milk, a crying child on your shoulder, a book in your hand because life is short and you too are thirsty. So there's like turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. There's like this, on the one hand, the parent is thirsty and wants to read the poem, is listening for something, and then on the other hand has this task, which is in their case like the child, which they cannot refuse. And maybe that's kind of like what the tension is. And the bitterness and hope, I don't know. I mean, I come back to like the ethical loneliness idea of just the feeling of for so long being so excluded, or, in the case of the young people by the fluorescent light, counted out or having counted themselves out, that leads to such extraordinary bitterness. And yet by reading the poem is a kind of act of hope against that bitterness. But then the last part, which is so beautiful, I know you're reading this poem because there's nothing else left to read, there where you have landed, stripped as you are.
I really like the way that the poem eases into its more figurative realm, because you do get basically everywhere up till this point has been given a place. And then before those last two I know you were reading, you do get taken from a physical place to somebody who's struggling with language. So you're almost already moved out of these described locations into still a discrete realm, but one that is not tied to a place. And then you get the I know you were reading this poem, listening for something torn between bitterness and hope. And then you're kind of deposited back in a nondescript physical place at the very end where you have landed, stripped as you are. So I'm interested in that transportation away from the physical and then back to it that happens over this little figurative segment at the end. But I don't know that that really helps me get a better handle on what I think is really going on in it. Yeah, I agree that it is cool that you're given that concrete example of a task that can't be refused with the child, but I think that's also an acknowledgement that to some degree having time to read, and especially having time to like read and think about poetry, is a little bit of a luxury, especially to be deeply engaging with it the way I think implicitly all of the people in this poem are. They all feel to me like people who are getting something vital out of the fact that they're reading the poem. It's not just that they're reading it, but that it is a really important reading experience. And so the idea that it is in some way also a little bit of a transportive experience for them. You're reading the poem, listening for something, you're looking for something in the reading experience that is more than just distraction. It might be that it is what takes you away from your present surroundings or your present concerns, but there's something core that you're trying to get to through the reading experience. And I think not precisely, but a little bit where I go with that ending is that this is the end of the poem. That experience is over. There is nothing left to read. And when you're done reading, we have a lot of names for whatever this is, suspension of disbelief or immersion in the narrative or like whatever, but you're done and you're dropped back into your reality. There's a task that you can't refuse now, because even if you were just reading this poem to procrastinate, it's over now. Sorry. Time to get back to living. And you are stripped back down to being yourself. And I think, through the poem reading experience, you can become many things, and you can be many things in the world of the poem. You can be transported into it, or you can access parts of yourself that are different from the everyday, mundane parts that you feel like you're most often engaging with or using. And when the poem ends and that world that you've been a part of concludes, you are stripped back down to whatever base elements of yourself there are. And you can still reach out to those things that you accessed when you were in the poem and bring them into that life, but when the poem ends, you've landed back in the world, stripped of that, magic or essence or whatever, and you have to then consciously recruit it as opposed to give yourself over to it when you're actually reading.
I like that a lot. Should we read it again?
I think we should read it again.
Dedications by Adrienne Rich. I know you are reading this poem late, before leaving your office, of the one intense yellow lamp spot in a darkening window, in the lassitude of a building faded to quiet long after rush hour. I know you are reading this poem standing up in a bookstore far from the ocean on a gray day of early spring, faint flakes driven across the plain's enormous spaces around you. I know you are reading this poem in a room where too much has happened for you to bear, where the bedclothes lie in stagnant coils on the bed, and the open valise speaks of flight, but you cannot leave yet. I know you are reading this poem as the underground train loses momentum, and before running up the stairs toward a new kind of love your life has never allowed. I know you are reading this poem by the light of the television screen, where soundless images jerk and slide while you wait for the newscast from the Intifada. I know you are reading this poem in a waiting room, of eyes met and unmeeting, of identity with strangers. I know you are reading this poem by fluorescent light, in the boredom and fatigue of the young who are counted out, count themselves out at too early an age. I know you are reading this poem through your failing sight, the thick lens enlarging these letters beyond all meaning, yet you read on, because even the alphabet is precious. I know you are reading this poem as you pace beside the stove warming milk, a crying child on your shoulder, a book in your hand, because life is short and you too are thirsty. I know you are reading this poem which is not your language, guessing at some words while others keep you reading, and I want to know which words they are. I know you are reading this poem listening for something, torn between bitterness and hope, turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. I know you are reading this poem because there is nothing else left to read, there where you have landed, stripped as you are.
Hey, thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Those reviews help us with the algorithm and are the best way for us to find new listeners.
Do you have thoughts about this poem? Or is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? We would love to hear from you, and there are tons of ways to get in touch.
Yes, you can send us an email to closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. I'm at Jack Rossiter Munn, Connor is at Connor M. Stratton, and the show is at Close Talking.
On Instagram, we are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/closetalking.
And speaking of all of those many and varied social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena.
Woo woo!
Woo.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Come back again.
Please come back just one more time.
Door's always open. Okay, bye.
See ya.